Good morning. Brian asked me to say why is it that the housing advocates, or me in particular as a particular housing advocate, should care about inclusionary zoning. So I first fell in love with inclusionary zoning, or I call it inclusionary housing, and I know that Richard and I had yeasty debates about is it inclusionary zoning or inclusionary housing. I like to call it inclusionary housing because for me the housing is the important part of it. The inclusionary part's good too, and of course it is about zoning. But I first fell in love with it about a decade ago when I joined the Wellesley Institute and was asked to build our housing practice at the Wellesley Institute, in particular to identify the kinds of tools and mechanisms that were necessary in order to have a comprehensive housing plan for Toronto so that everyone could have a good place to call home. That's when I met Richard, and he's been my inclusionary zoning hero ever since. Although Richard, I have to say to you that a few weeks ago I was in Australia at an international housing summit. I met a guy named Mark Jarr. I don't know if you've come across Mark. Worked for Bloomberg when he was mayor of New York City developing his housing. And Mark is an absolute genius at taking inclusionary zoning rules such as they exist in New York City, packaging them with the tax credit programs, with all the other little bits and pieces of what passes for housing policy in the United States, and actually generating not only affordable housing but social housing. So next to you, he is one of my housing heroes in terms of this issue. My view of housing is always like this photograph. It's from Woodbridge in the 1870s or something like that. The photographer's not known. I imagine that it's they're building some sort of community building, but it's this notion that it takes an entire community to build housing. It's not just one thing. I think that's the theme in terms of inclusionary housing, that it's an important part of the process, but it's not the only thing that we need to be concerned about. And I always like drawing people's attention in terms of this building of housing, this guy right here, the trombone player, because I think that the role of trombones in terms of housing policy is sadly under-theorized, and I think we need to spend some time on that. But let's go to the next slide. That's not our... So top 3 reasons why advocates should back inclusionary housing. First of all, although Richard's correct that we haven't had something that could actually strictly be called inclusionary zoning, we actually have had things that pass for kinds of inclusionary housing in the past, and they've worked. Secondly, that it's effective at tackling housing segregation, which I think is one of the big and growing issues in Toronto. And third, that it is an important part, although not the only part, of a complete affordable housing toolkit. Next slide, please. So Toronto in 1910, people will recognize what was then called New City Hall. Now we call it Old City Hall, and in the shadow of Old City Hall, the ward, the slum. I think, was it last night that there was the book launch for a book on the history of the ward? Anyway, Toronto had a lot of slum districts back in the first and second decades of the 20th century, and this became a significant issue, and one of the solutions, next slide please, was housing. Let's regenerate the housing, and this is, some people may recognize as Spruce Court housing. It was the first affordable housing. The medical officer of health, Dr. Charles Hastings, amongst others, was responsible for instilling it. You can actually still go, many of you are familiar with it. I know Mary will, anyone that's involved with the co-op housing sector, Maura. So built in 1913. If you go along Spruce Street in one of the gentrified neighborhoods of Toronto, where I understand houses are $1 million and more, I don't actually know if that's what they really are, but the right smack in the middle is some great housing for families, and it's now run as a nonprofit co-op. You can find lots of other one-off examples of that. Most recently, of course, a project that's still in the development stage, but the Tridell Haynes project with Artscape down on the waterfront, which briefly surfaced in the papers last year, and our mayor at the time commented they didn't think that low-income people should live on the waterfront. It should be reserved for the decent and respectable people, millionaires and others of his sort. But that project has gone ahead. And again, these are all kind of one-off projects, but they show us that in fact we can mix affordable and social housing in with other kinds of housing. Next slide, please. Now, some of you are familiar with the work of David Olchansky at the University of Toronto. David and others were working on the Three Cities project in the early phase of that back in the day. And this shows a map of Toronto from, this is actually 1970. Sort of middle-income neighborhoods. The blue bits are the rich neighborhoods, and the red bits are the lower-income neighborhoods. And what you can see is about 60% of Toronto is middle income, and then there's some rich bits and some poor bits. Next slide, please. I could do the 5-year progression, but I'll just skip ahead to 2005.
So,
Back.
okay, sorry.
2005, transformation of our city. We are manufacturing a divided city where the previously middle-income neighborhoods are poor income, the rich neighborhoods are still rich. Good for them. They managed to hold on to their wealth, and that's great, because we don't need more homeless millionaires crowding our homeless shelters, which are already full. But the lower income neighborhoods, or the middle income neighborhoods of all, or many of them have now gone. So we've created a divided city, and of course, it's not a secret that it's also racially divided. That the highest income neighborhoods are the whitest neighborhoods, and the lower income neighborhoods are the neighborhoods with people with racialized backgrounds. So, next slide. And it's also created an unhealthy city. Now, just recently, Toronto Public Health issued the latest of their unequal city reports, but a few years ago, Toronto Public Health and the Wellesley Institute were involved in mapping some diseases over the city. And this, for instance, is a map of the prevalence of diabetes. The lighter areas, lower prevalence of diabetes, the darker areas, higher prevalence of diabetes, and there's an almost exact overlay. So not only are we segregating people by income and by race, but we're creating an unhealthy city. And this is something that is a phenomenon that's come upon Toronto and other places that we need to tackle. We need tools to tackle this. Next slide, please. And we can see the extreme examples of that. I know that it's a cliche to put a burning car on a US urban street. This was about 2 weeks ago in Baltimore, of course. And you may think, okay, once again, the advocates are sounding, the alarm bells and so on. But next slide. Last Sunday, I'm sure all of you read in the New York Times, the editorial started Housing Apartheid American Style, which talks about the riots in Baltimore and situates them within this notion that one of the key issues that's sparking the riots of 2015 is, the proximate cause is, of course, police shooting black people, but the underlying social, economic, and other issues are this continuing segregation and division between black and white in the United States. In 1967, and I have to stop and just make one personal comment, that in 1967 my family happened to be in Denver in the United States, which is in the middle of the United States, and doesn't have a particular reputation, except Denver, like a lot of cities in 1967, the inner city was boiling. We happened to live in the inner city, and there were a lot of things when busing of our high school, they wanted to bring white kids into our high school and send the black kids out to the suburbs, and somebody firebombed all the school buses to stop that from happening. So I remember 67 and the riots very well from a personal basis. But anyway, one of the things they talk about is that, of course, the combination of the riots in 67 and then the assassination of Dr. King in 68, which led to even more riots, was that the US President and Congress passed the Fair Housing Act. And the Fair Housing Act is part of a basket of legislation at the US federal level. It was intended to try and address the issue of segregation and discrimination in housing. So it started off with some high-level statements of aspiration, and then set in place particular programs, including some funding programs based in, you may be familiar with the Community Reinvestment Act and so on. So, good. There were problems, the government responded, but as the New York Times notes, the effort was hampered from the beginning by local officials who ignored or opposed the goal of desegregation, and by federal officials, including presidents, who simply declined to enforce it. Next question. Next slide, sorry. And Richard Nixon, since we're here in the United Church, let's acknowledge that Mr. Nixon grew up in a good Quaker household. He had a good, solid moral upbringing. President Nixon this is one of his memos on the Fair Housing Act. I'm convinced that while legal segregation is totally wrong, forced integration of housing or education is just as wrong. I realize that this position will lead us to a situation in which blacks will continue to live for the most part in black neighborhoods and where there will be predominantly black schools and predominantly white schools. So the problem in the United States was not a problem of people not understanding that there was a serious issue in terms of segregation of communities and a serious need for government to respond. In fact, government did respond in various ways, but it was this euphemistic thing we often call political will, which actually should be more sharpened to say it was actually the resistance, starting with the president, but including right down to local officials saying, no, we don't want to do that. And I think that's a caution for us as we think about inclusionary housing now, that yes, we need to get the enabling legislation, Richard, and yes, we need to get the mechanisms right, we need to get the developers on board and so on, but we also need to get those ward councillors and others and we need to ensure that they're not blocking it behind the scenes as happened in the United States. Next slide, please. So I can think of, as of the end of February of this year, 167,531 reasons why Toronto should have inclusionary housing. And that's the number of people on the Toronto housing wait list, both the active and inactive list. And just you can look at anything you want to look at, but if you happen to look at the last 10 years, that's an 81% increase. So we're not only are we generating segregated neighborhoods by income, by housing, by health, by race, but we're generating huge housing need. And that is, and if you look at February, for instance, there were 2,097 new applications in that month, and 208 people were housed during that month. So, you know, we desperately need more mechanisms. Richard's point that inclusionary zoning alone will not take people off the wait list, because these are people that have very low incomes, but that is part of the solution along with some other things. Next. I want to make the point in a way that breaks every rule of PowerPoint presentations. And I want you to understand that yes, inclusionary housing or zoning is a very important issue, but no, it's not the magic bullet that will solve all of our problems. And here from 2009 is what the Housing Network of Ontario said to the provincial government is what is needed in terms of some of the elements of a comprehensive housing toolkit. So next. So we need bold targets and sustained funding. So yes, we need money. We need an inclusionary housing policy, but we also need governments, and we need various other sources of capital, both to build new housing and to fix and repair the existing housing. Next one. We need a solid measuring stick. We need governments to be accountable for these initiatives. In the long-term affordable housing strategy the province announced about 2 years ago, they said to municipalities, you have to come up with 10-year plans to end homelessness in your communities and 10-year plans to meet the range of housing needs in your community. I haven't seen a single municipality that has been held accountable by the provincial government, or indeed held accountable by the people at municipality, saying, where's your 10-year plan? How well are you doing? What's happening with your 10-year plan? So we need to take seriously this notion that we have to have a solid measuring stick. Next. We need an accountability, annual public reporting. We need residence review committees that are equitably representative of all people experiencing various kinds of housing insecurity. There's not one housing need, there's a range of housing needs, and we need, and this is an item I'm not allowed to, I signed a piece of paper saying I'm not supposed to tell you what happens in the meetings of the expert advisory panel on homelessness.
But you're going to anyway.
But no, I can't. Some of this work has been done, but we of course wanted various pieces of legislation, including the Social Housing Reform Act, the Residential Tenancies Act. We said to introduce inclusionary housing policies, et cetera, et cetera. Final slide is that one. So we need all of that, but we also need inclusionary housing to help us, to give us one of the tools so that that smart guy that I met, Mark Jarr, can come to Toronto, and then he can teach us how we can put together all the bits and pieces and come up with the housing that we need.